Rebecca Carter had just finished another exhausting night shift at St. Anne's General Hospital. Her scrubs clung to her, wrinkled and faintly damp from hours of running between patients. The early morning light outside was gray and soft, hinting at the rain that had begun to drizzle during the night. All she could think about was her small apartment, a warm shower, and the chance to finally collapse into bed. But as she walked through the hospital's bustling lobby, she noticed something that stopped her in her tracks. A man sat on one of the hard plastic chairs near the reception desk, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed. His dark suit was crumpled, as though he had slept in it or more likely, hadn't slept at all. His tie hung loosely around his neck, and his hands were trembling slightly, fingers gripping a tissue that had long since been shredded. Beside him sat a little girl with blonde curls that looked as though they had been hastily brushed. She clutched a stuffed bunny so tightly that its ears were bent at odd angles. Her wide eyes darted between her father and the room around her, as if she were trying to understand what had happened but couldn't quite piece it together. Rebecca felt the kind of pull she always did when she saw someone in pain. She had seen grief in all its forms during her years as a nurse, and this man's despair was unmistakable. She could have kept walking, telling herself that she had already done enough for one shift, but she knew she wouldn't. Instead, she approached slowly, careful not to startle them. Kneeling down to the girl's level, Rebecca smiled gently. "Hi there," she said softly, her tone soothing. "What's your bunny's name?" The little girl blinked up at her, hesitating before replying in a small voice, "Bun Bun." "That's a wonderful name," Rebecca said, nodding appreciatively. "Bun Bun looks like a very good friend." The girl didn't say anything else, but her grip on the bunny loosened just slightly. Rebecca turned her attention to the man who had barely lifted his head. "Hi," she said, her voice as kind as she could make it. "I'm Rebecca. Are you waiting for someone?" He looked up then, and Rebecca was struck by the depth of his grief. His dark eyes were rimmed with red and his face was pale and drawn. It was the look of someone who had been broken by something sudden and cruel. "No," he said after a long pause, his voice hoarse. My wife," he stopped, swallowing hard. "She's gone. It happened so fast. I didn't even get to say goodbye." Rebecca's chest tightened. She had seen it too many times, families blindsided by loss, their lives upended in a single moment. She didn't know the details, but she didn't need to. The raw pain in his expression said enough. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, sitting down on the chair next to him. "I can't imagine how hard this is for you." The man ran a hand through his hair, his fingers shaking. "I don't even know how I got here," he admitted. "I just grabbed my daughter and drove. I left the house with nothing. I don't have my wallet. I don't even have my phone." His voice cracked, and he turned his face away, his shoulders shaking as he struggled to hold back tears. "I don't know how I'm going to get her home. I don't know what to do." Rebecca's heart ached for him. She glanced at the little girl, who was watching her father with a worried expression. She couldn't imagine what it must feel like to lose a partner so suddenly, or to be a little girl who didn't fully understand what was happening, but could sense that her whole world had changed. Rebecca reached into her bag and pulled out a $20 bill. "Here," she said, pressing it into his hand. "This should cover your taxi fare." The man looked at the bill as if it were a foreign object. "I can't take this," he said, shaking his head. "You've already done enough." "You're not taking it," Rebecca replied firmly, her voice kind but unwavering. "I'm giving it to you. You need to get your little girl home, and this will help you do that. Let me do this for you." He stared at her for a long moment before his resolve crumbled. His hand closed around the bill and he nodded. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to," Rebecca said, offering him a small smile. "Just take care of your daughter. That's all that matters right now." As he stood to leave, the little girl tugged on Rebecca's sleeve. "Thank you for helping my daddy," she said softly, her voice trembling. Rebecca knelt down and smiled at her. "You're very welcome, sweetheart. You and your daddy are going to be okay." The man called for a taxi using the hospital's courtesy phone, and when it arrived, Rebecca helped them to the door. The little girl waved at her through the window as they drove away, her bunny clutched tightly in her arms. Rebecca watched until the taxi disappeared down the street, her chest heavy with emotion. Walking to her car, she tried to shake off the weight of the encounter. She didn't expect to see them again, but she couldn't stop thinking about the man's hollow eyes or the little girl's quiet thank you. She hoped that her small gesture had made their impossible day just a little more bearable. What she didn't know was that the man who had seemed so broken that morning wasn't just any grieving husband. He was Peter Blake, the CEO of a successful tech company. And though he had left with nothing in his pockets but a crumpled $20 bill, he was carrying something far more valuable: the words of a nurse who had reminded him that even in the darkest moments, there was a way forward. The weeks that followed were a haze of paperwork, phone calls, and sleepless nights for Peter Blake. Emily's sudden passing had left a void he couldn't begin to fill, and every room in their sprawling home reminded him of her absence. It didn't matter how much money he had or how successful his business ventures were, none of it could ease the pain of losing the woman who had been his anchor and the mother of his daughter. Still, Peter knew he couldn't fall apart. Sophie needed him, and that alone forced him to keep moving. Her questions about Emily came frequently, and while he did his best to answer them, there were moments when he had to excuse himself, afraid she would see him cry. At night, after Sophie was asleep, he sat in his home office staring blankly at his computer, consumed by the memories of Emily's laughter and the plans they'd made for the future. But amid the chaos and grief, Peter often found himself thinking about the nurse who had helped him that day at the hospital. Rebecca, she had said her name was. She had been calm and steady in a way that had cut through the fog of his despair. Her words, "take it one step at a time," played on repeat in his mind during the hardest moments. They weren't just words, they had become a mantra, a lifeline he clung to when everything felt overwhelming. One afternoon, as Peter sat in his office organizing some of Emily's belongings, Sophie wandered in holding her bunny. "Daddy," she said softly, "do you think Mommy can see us?" Peter swallowed hard and nodded. "I think so, sweetheart." Sophie climbed onto his lap, resting her head against his chest. "I think she wants us to be happy," she said, her small voice filled with an innocence that broke Peter's heart. "Even if we miss her a lot." Peter hugged her tightly, the warmth of her little body grounding him. "I think you're right," he said, "and we're going to be okay. We just have to take it one step at a time, remember?" Sophie nodded solemnly. "Like the nice lady said at the hospital." Peter smiled faintly. "Exactly like that." That evening, after Sophie was in bed, Peter opened his laptop. He had been meaning to write a letter to Rebecca ever since that day, but he had kept putting it off, unsure of how to express what he was feeling. Now, as he stared at the blank screen, the words began to flow. "Dear Rebecca. Dia. I don't know if you remember me, but a few weeks ago you helped my daughter Sophie and me at St. Anne's. My wife, Emily, had just passed away, and I was lost in a way I can't begin to describe. You bought us breakfast, gave me money for a taxi, and told me something that I've held on to ever since: take it one step at a time. At the time, I didn't know how I was going to get through the day, let alone the weeks ahead. But your kindness, your calm voice, and those simple words gave me something to cling to when everything felt impossible. You didn't just help me get home that day, you reminded me that it was okay to move forward, even when it felt like I couldn't. Since that day, I've tried to live by what you said. It hasn't been easy, but I've taken things one step at a time, and slowly, we're finding our way. Sophie is back in school and laughing again. I've started volunteering at her events and focusing on what truly matters in life. And through it all, your words have stayed with me. I wanted to do something to thank you, though I know no gift could truly repay the impact you've had on me. Enclosed is a check for $2,500. Please use it in whatever way will bring you the most joy, whether it's for yourself, your family, or even for others. It's a small way of showing my gratitude for how you helped me when I needed it most. Thank you for being the kind of person who makes the world brighter, even for strangers. Your kindness kept me going, and I'll never forget it. Sincerely, Peter Blake. Peter folded the letter and placed it in an envelope along with the check. As he sealed it, he felt a weight lift from his chest. Rebecca had given him hope when he had none, and now he wanted her to know just how much her compassion had mattered. The next morning, Peter dropped the letter off at the hospital's front desk, asking that it be delivered to Rebecca Carter. As he walked back to his car, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks, a quiet sense of peace. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that things might truly get better. One step at a time. Rebecca Carter was finishing a busy shift at St. Anne's when the receptionist flagged her down. "Rebecca," she called, holding up a sealed envelope. "Someone left this for you earlier." Rebecca wiped her hands on her scrubs, surprised. She wasn't used to receiving mail at work. "Who's it from?" she asked. The receptionist shrugged. "Didn't say. Just asked that it be delivered to you." Curious, Rebecca tucked the envelope into her bag, intending to read it during her break. It wasn't until hours later, when she was finally seated in the quiet staff lounge with a cup of tea, that she remembered it. Pulling it out, she noticed her name written in elegant script on the front. She opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the letter inside. Her eyes skimmed the first few lines, and she immediately recognized the name Peter Blake. The memory of that morning at the hospital came rushing back, the grief-stricken man, his daughter clutching her stuffed bunny, and the taxi fare she had insisted he take. She had thought about them often in the days following their encounter, wondering how they were managing, but life had swept her up in its relentless pace and she hadn't dwelled on it. Now, as she read Peter's letter, she felt her chest tighten. His words were raw, heartfelt, and full of gratitude. He described how her simple kindness had helped him find a way forward during the darkest moment of his life, how her advice, "take it one step at a time," had become a guiding principle for him and his daughter. By the time she reached the end of the letter, her hands were trembling. Enclosed with the letter was a check for $2,500, along with a note encouraging her to use it in whatever way brought her the most happiness. Rebecca sat back, stunned. She read the letter again, her mind spinning. She hadn't known Peter was wealthy. It hadn't mattered to her that day, nor did it now. What moved her was the thoughtfulness behind his gesture, the depth of his appreciation. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she realized just how deeply her actions had resonated with him. For a long moment she sat there in the quiet room, holding the letter and reflecting on the ripple effect of kindness. She thought back to why she had become a nurse in the first place, to make a difference, even in the smallest ways. This letter was proof that those moments of compassion mattered more than she had ever imagined. The next day, Rebecca decided to write back. Sitting at her small kitchen table in her modest apartment, she chose her words carefully, wanting to convey the gratitude and humility she felt. "Dear Peter, I cannot express how much your letter meant to me. Reading your words brought tears to my eyes and reminded me why I do what I do. It's easy, in the rush of a busy hospital, to wonder if the small things we do make a real difference. Your letter is proof that they do. I remember you and Sophie clearly. Even in your grief, I could see the love you had for your daughter, and I had no doubt that you would find a way to carry on for her. Hearing how far you've come, and knowing that Sophie is laughing and thriving again, fills my heart with joy. As for your generous gift, I hardly know what to say. Thank you doesn't feel like enough. Your kindness is overwhelming, and I will make sure it is put to good use. You've reminded me that the world is full of people who care deeply, and that even in the darkest moments, there is light. If you ever need someone to talk to, or if Sophie ever wants to visit Bun's friend at the hospital, I hope you'll reach out. It would be an honor to see how far you've come. With gratitude, Rebecca Carter." Rebecca folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, addressing it to Peter's office. As she mailed it that afternoon, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The world could be heavy and overwhelming, but small acts of kindness could shift the weight. She carried that thought with her as she returned to work, determined to keep giving what she could, knowing now that it mattered more than she might ever see. Far away, Peter opened Rebecca's reply a few days later, and smiled as he read her thoughtful words. He showed Sophie, who clapped her hands excitedly at the mention of Bun. Together, they decided they would visit Rebecca someday, not just to thank her again, but to share their journey and the joy they had found. Rebecca's words stayed with Peter as he continued rebuilding his life. For him and for Rebecca, it was a reminder that even the smallest kindness could change everything. In the months that followed, Peter and Sophie gradually settled into a new rhythm. Life without Emily was still a void that neither of them could fully fill, but together, they began to find ways to create moments of joy. Peter started leaving work early at least once a week to take Sophie to the park or the local ice cream shop, where she always picked strawberry with rainbow sprinkles. At night, he read her favorite bedtime stories, often falling asleep halfway through the third or fourth book. Peter's growing success at work allowed him to make changes that mattered more than ever. He redirected his focus from long hours and high-stakes meetings to building a balanced life, one that prioritized time with Sophie. This shift brought unexpected happiness, a quiet fulfillment he hadn't known he was missing even before Emily's passing. One sunny Saturday morning, Peter decided it was time to visit Rebecca. He had been meaning to for weeks, but something had always stopped him: work obligations, Sophie's school activities, or perhaps the fear that it might seem intrusive. But as he and Sophie sat on the living room floor organizing her growing collection of crayons, Sophie looked up and asked, "Daddy, when can we visit the nice lady from the hospital?" Peter smiled, ruffling her blonde curls. "How about today?" Sophie's face lit up. "Really? Can we bring Bun Bun?" "Of course," Peter said. "I think Bun Bun would love to meet her again." After calling ahead to ensure Rebecca would be working that day, Peter packed Sophie into the car and made the familiar drive to St. Anne's. Sophie chattered the whole way, excited about the visit and full of stories she couldn't wait to share. Peter, meanwhile, felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. Rebecca had become such a pivotal figure in his life, and he wanted her to know how deeply her kindness had impacted him. When they arrived, Peter held Sophie's hand as they made their way to the reception desk. "We're here to see Rebecca Carter," he said to the receptionist, who smiled warmly. "She's in the pediatric ward today," the receptionist replied. "I'll let her know you're here." A few minutes later, Rebecca appeared in the hallway, her scrubs a cheerful shade of blue and her curly hair pulled back into a loose bun. When she saw Peter and Sophie, her face broke into a bright smile. "Peter," she said warmly, "and Sophie. It's so good to see you." Sophie ran up to her, holding out Bun Bun. "Look, Bun Bun came too." Rebecca knelt down to Sophie's level, her smile widening. "Bun Bun looks just as lovely as I remember. How are you, Sophie?" "I'm good," Sophie said, bouncing on her toes. "Daddy and I went to the park yesterday, and I got to ride the big swings." "That sounds wonderful," Rebecca replied, standing and turning to Peter. "And how are you?" she asked gently. Peter smiled, though his voice carried a hint of emotion. "Better," he said. "Thanks to you. I'm not sure how we would have made it through those first weeks without your help." Rebecca gestured toward a bench near the hallway. "Would you like to sit for a moment? I'd love to hear how you've been." As they sat and talked, Peter shared how life had begun to stabilize. He spoke about Sophie's resilience, his decision to prioritize family, and how Rebecca's words had become a guiding light for him during the darkest moments. Sophie chimed in with her own stories, proudly describing her school art projects and her newfound love of bike riding. Rebecca listened intently, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. Seeing the transformation in Peter and Sophie reminded her why she had chosen this path, a path often filled with stress and exhaustion but also profound rewards. She realized that the impact of her work went far beyond the walls of the hospital. Before they left, Sophie gave Rebecca a drawing she had made that morning, a picture of Sophie, Peter, and Bun Bun standing with a woman in scrubs. Above the figures, Sophie had written in her careful, wobbly handwriting, "Thank you for helping us." Rebecca accepted the drawing with misty eyes. "Thank you, Sophie," she said, her voice soft. "This is the most beautiful gift I've ever received." As Peter and Sophie walked back to the car, Peter felt a deep sense of closure and gratitude. Visiting Rebecca had been more than just a way to say thank you, it had been a chance to show her the ripples of her compassion, to remind her of the lives she had touched. For Rebecca, the visit was a poignant reminder that even the smallest gestures could have a profound impact. As she hung Sophie's drawing in her locker, she thought about the many patients and families she had cared for over the years. She might never know the full extent of her influence, but moments like this reminded her that kindness always mattered. Peter, Sophie, and Rebecca's lives were forever connected, a testament to the enduring power of compassion. One step at a time, they each continued forward, carrying with them the lessons and love that had grown from a single moment of generosity. The visit to Rebecca marked a turning point not just for Peter and Sophie, but for Rebecca as well. The simple reminder of how much her small act of kindness had rippled through their lives stayed with her long after they left. Sophie's drawing hung proudly in her locker at the hospital, a daily reminder of why she had chosen this career and the difference it could make. Every time she saw it, she smiled, thinking of the bright little girl who had endured so much yet still radiated joy and hope. For Peter, reconnecting with Rebecca reinforced his commitment to a life built on gratitude and compassion. He had spent years focused on success, on making deals and building his company. But losing Emily and meeting Rebecca had reshaped his perspective. His wealth, he realized, wasn't just a tool for security, it was an opportunity to create meaning and help others. One afternoon, as he was reviewing quarterly reports in his office, Peter had an idea. He stared at the screen for a moment, then closed his laptop and began drafting a plan. Over the next few weeks, he worked quietly but diligently, reaching out to his board of directors and a few trusted colleagues. By the end of the month, the foundation he envisioned had been approved, the Steps of Kindness initiative. It was designed to provide immediate financial and emotional support to families facing sudden tragedy, ensuring they wouldn't have to navigate their darkest moments alone. On the day the foundation launched, Peter sent Rebecca an invitation to the small ceremony they were holding to announce its creation. Held in a sunlit conference room at his company's headquarters, the event was simple but heartfelt. A handful of employees and partners attended, along with Sophie, who sat in the front row clutching Bun Bun. Rebecca arrived just before the event began, surprised but touched by the invitation. When Peter introduced her during his speech, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but she couldn't help but smile as he described how her kindness had inspired the foundation's creation. "Rebecca didn't just help me find a taxi that day," Peter said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "She gave me the strength to believe I could take the next step, even when I didn't know how. Her compassion reminded me that even in our darkest hours, there's light to be found if we're willing to reach for it. This foundation is a way to pass that light on to others." After the event, Peter approached Rebecca, Sophie skipping happily by his side. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said. "You reminded me of what really matters." Rebecca shook her head, smiling warmly. "You would have found your way, Peter. You're stronger than you realize. But I'm honored to have played a small part." As Sophie tugged on Rebecca's hand to show her a tray of cookies at the refreshment table, Peter looked on with quiet gratitude. What had started as a single moment of kindness had grown into something far greater, a testament to the power of human connection. In the weeks and months that followed, the Steps of Kindness initiative began to make a tangible impact. Families across the city received help with medical bills, funeral expenses, and counseling services. Each recipient received a letter with the foundation's motto, "One step at a time, we walk forward together." Rebecca continued her work at the hospital, finding renewed purpose in her role. Whenever she encountered families in distress, she thought of Peter and Sophie, and she knew that even the smallest gesture could change a life. As for Peter and Sophie, their lives flourished. Sophie's laughter filled their home once more, and Peter found fulfillment not just in his career but in the connections he was building with others. They visited Rebecca occasionally, sometimes bringing flowers or handmade cards from Sophie. One sunny afternoon, as Peter watched Sophie play on a swing at the park, he felt Emily's absence keenly. But he also felt her presence in the little girl's joy and in the kindness that had come to define their lives. He knew that while they could never go back to the life they'd had before, they had found a way to honor Emily's memory by moving forward with love, one step at a time. And somewhere, in her own quiet corner of the world, Rebecca smiled as she reread Sophie's drawing on her locker, knowing that the simplest act of kindness could spark a transformation far beyond anything she could have imagined.